The average person is said to spend 15 minutes in the bathroom. Why not take advantage of that time and learn something new? Presenting the 15-minute podcast on weird facts, crazy details, and funny particulars that you'll be able to enjoy while you're taking a on your free time. Welcome to The Shit with Sam Butler.
Welcome to another episode of The Shit Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Butler. I want to thank everybody for joining me once again on this podcast. It's the first podcast of 2023. I'm glad to be back off of vacation. I had a good Christmas. I hope everybody had a good New Year's, Christmas. We were with family and friends, which is the most important thing in life. With that being said, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to be listened by y'all. With that being said, I have some very exciting news. As of yesterday, this will air next week. So, the time this is recorded, it's only been like 24 hours since I got my Mexican citizenship, which is very exciting because as a Mexican, if you are of Mexican descent, by right, you are a Mexican citizen. It just takes a while to get your documentation. But in Mexico, there's a law that says that if your parents were born in Mexico, or if your grandparents were born in Mexico, or if your great-grandparents were born in Mexico, you're a Mexican by blood right. And therefore, I'm super excited and happy to finally have gotten all my official documentation, and I have my Mexican citizenship. Now, this is possible because there is a law between the United States and Mexico allowing for a dual citizenship. I still live in the United States, but it's been a dream of mine to have both citizenships because of my mom. My mom was born here in Mexico, and of course, I grew up in a border town. And if you grew up in El Paso, you know that it's 90% Latino, and our whole culture is Mexican. Although we're just on the other side of that border. I like to say El Paso is like Mexico's gated community, literally. But I'm happy I finally got my citizenship. I'm glad to be working in Mexico. This podcast is recorded in Mexico, so it makes things just a lot easier for me from that standpoint as well. With that being said, I got to enjoy Christmas, the holiday, in Colombia. And that was a place that I always wanted to visit, and I'm glad I got to go do that. And the episode that we're talking about today is something that I started researching maybe a couple of months ago, and it just happened to land with the fact that I was visiting Colombia. And what it's about is I came across an article that was super interesting. Colombia was conquered by the Spanish as well as Mexico and other countries in Latin America. And what they started doing was importing slaves. We know that started happening right after Christopher Columbus. As a matter of fact, Christopher Columbus landed in Cuba, and we know he wiped out the population in Cuba with disease. And so then they didn't have anybody that could work the fields, so they started buying slaves from Africa and bringing them to work. And if you go to the Caribbean, you'll see that there's a huge black population, and 99.9% of those people are descendants of slave in the slave trade. Well, I got to go to Colombia, and in Colombia, I had heard about this the first free ex-slave colony in the Americas. And they just happened to be located about 50 kilometers, that's like 25 miles away from the city of Cartagena. Now, what happened was the slaves there decided they wanted to escape. They had like their own version of the Underground Railroad, but it was just a little bit different. They did something that to me is the shit. It's super interesting. What they would do is they would actually use the girl's hair, because you'll see a lot of African American and Latin American communities of black descent, of African descent. You'll see that they still braid their hair. Well, in Colombia, what they did back in the 1600s, they came up with a plan to braid their hair, and in those braids, braid them in a way that they would create a map, an escape route, so that people knew how to escape slavery. And to me, this was super genius that they came up with this. We're going to braid a map into your head. And then that's going to tell everyone how we're going to escape and when we're going to escape. And it was interesting as well that they would braid a pocket into their hair, and they would utilize this pocket as a place to store seeds. We don't think a lot about it nowadays because we go and get our food at the supermarket, and we get our vegetables in the supermarket. And so for us, maybe if we're not into planting and growing, we don't think twice. But it was a shock to me to find out that to them, that was a matter of life or death. Do we have a way to plant food? So what they would do is they'd braid in a pocket into one of the braids, and the women would hide seeds in those pockets. And that way they had a way to not only escape, but also grow their own food. Super ingenious. I mean, just the fact that you can think of, I'm going to go ahead and braid a map into your hair, and how they learn to recognize the different routes based on that. Now, I was in Cartagena, and we found a good taxi driver. And I say a good one because there's a lot of them, but we found one that we felt was pretty honest and straightforward with us. And he started kind of driving us to different places and would offer, we got his information, which is a travel hack. If you're ever traveling and you find a good Uber driver, a good taxi driver, someone that is helpful, take his information, call him up, make all your arrangements through that driver, and you'll have probably the least expensive way to get to see everything, because you'll have someone that you can kind of trust. Now, I'm not saying trust just anybody, but you'll get a feel for people once you travel a lot. And that's something that I've done in other countries whenever I visited. If I hit it off with a taxi driver, if I hit it off with an Uber driver, I always make a point to get their information and then make all my arrangements through them. And I usually have a great time. So this taxi driver takes us to the town of Palenque. And see, I had thought that it ended with the braids. I thought, this is the shit. They're smart. They figured this out. But then I get there and I start to realize just how much ingenuity they had to put into their freedom. For example, Palenque here in Mexico, for y'all who have never been to Mexico or not very familiar, it pretty much means a ring or a kind of a makeshift arena, right? And they utilize sticks to create this circle, and then they'd have like cockfights or bullfights or whatever. It's usually in this Palenque. And so this town is called Palenque. And we got there, and they had these tree trunks that they stripped down bare, and they had set up in a circular pattern. And what they were doing is, when they would escape, they would create a fort. And they would use these tree trunks to create this fort, to create a protection from being recaptured. And they could kind of defend themselves that way. Of course, as soon as the Spanish understood that these guys had escaped, they were out looking for them. And so they would build these fortitudes to kind of protect them. And eventually they kept moving them until they settled in a valley where they could set up this fort and have lookouts. And they'd have lookouts up in the hills. And as soon as they know something was up, they'd get prepared. So there was different shifts. That's a lot of work. But it's not as much work as these guys had to do to obtain their freedom. And it makes you kind of wonder, what is the price of freedom? What is it that you have to pay for your freedom? We're fortunate in our countries, the United States and Mexico, that we relatively have freedoms and we have the ability to do stuff. But if you were a captive, what lengths would you go to? Something that I learned once we were in the town, our guide explained a lot of things to us. Like, he explained the posts, and all of the posts were green, black, and blue. And green obviously made reference to vegetation, to food, the blue to the sky and the sea, but then they would paint a black stripe, which was them, a reference to their people. And they dream about being back in Africa. They dream about being there either in life or in the next life, but to them, they still feel like they were taken from their home. And we're talking about 400 years later. This town was recognized as a free slave colony, the first one in the Americas, in 1603, this town of Palenque. And when you go to Colombia, you'll see ladies in the tourist parts in the old cities, you'll see them wearing these bright dresses, and they'll have a basket on their head, and they'll have fruit, and they'll take pictures with tourists, and they'll sing, and they'll do different things. Well, they are all from these settlements, these free black settlements that happened in the 1600s. And they were able to buy their freedom or obtain their freedom because they did it in such an organized way that they could actually mount a defense against being recaptured. And to me, that was super interesting. And I got to tour their town, and in touring their town, I got to see that they actually still have a dialect or a language that they utilize, and it's evolved over time, but it's a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, French, European languages mixed in with some Spanish languages, and they were able to, and some African. And so they're able to kind of still maintain their own culture. Their culture is very important to them. They have a mural with all of the basic words, and they start educating kids from a very young age in their language. Their level of education is pretty high. A lot of the people in the town read and write, and they are bilingual, even trilingual, because it is kind of a tourist destination. So if you ever get a chance to go to Cartagena, Colombia, and you find a good guide, I would suggest that you go. It's a 25-mile ride. It's a little bit slower than you might spend a good hour getting there and an hour getting back, and it takes about an hour or an hour and a half to tour the town. Maybe I think we took 3 hours, but we talked to different people. We went and saw a traditional African home in Colombia, and we saw I guess it's a medicine man that works with herbs and cures the town, and so they're still very much into their African culture. There is a Catholic church set in their town, and they pretty much did that so that the Spanish would let them exist. But they incorporated a lot of their African beliefs into the Christian beliefs so that they can maintain that cover, but they still very much believe in their traditional religion. That was one of the things that we discussed. There is a few musical groups that have come out of there that became famous over time. And so Palenque is this amazing place. It's an African colony in the Americas that still exists today. Their culture still exists today. So if you get a chance, check that out. Some of the things that struck out to us is the fact that they still preserve their culture. And it's the same people that had to figure out how to escape. Now, one of the big things that caught our eye when we were amazed us was how they were able to create these maps. Because how do you draw a map if you're captive? Well, what they would do, the women slaves would seduce the masters at night. And while they were seducing the masters, the men would escape, and they'd go and they'd survey the land, and they would create maps, and then they'd come back in the morning, early in the morning. They would relate the maps to the women. The women would braid it into the hair of the young girls and the girls, and then the men would go back to work. So imagine working as a slave 10, 12 hours, in the field, in the house, whatever your position was, and then your women, sacrificing your women sexually to the masters so that they would be distracted. And you say the masters, it's not one guy. You had all these different guys that were running these plantations. And so all these women would go and seduce these men. And while they're doing that, these guys are busy working and climbing hills. And I mean, some amazing geography in Colombia. So these guys are walking through the jungle, creating paths, leaving different marks, leaving trails, so they knew exactly how to get back. They would also agree on a meeting place, and they would braid that into the head of one of the girls, and that's how they would be able to all meet up when they decided to escape. And then there was power in numbers. So to me, this first episode of the shit is super exciting and important because I got to see it with my own eyes. I got to go and visit. This is something that I had started researching before I went, and then I was able to go. Amazing. I recommend that you guys go check that out if you get a chance. And with that being said, I'm wrapping up this episode of the Shit Podcast. I want to thank you guys for joining me once again. This is the first episode of the new year. We're going to keep them coming. You guys, hope you enjoyed. With that being said, please like and subscribe the channel. The more likes, the more subscriptions I've got, the more monetization that I get, and that allows me to continue to produce videos. And also, if you want to follow me on my social media, you can find me as Tu Amigo Sam. That's TU Amigo Sam on all my social media and my YouTube channel. And if you want to follow me on Spotify and other platforms for podcasts, you can find me as Sta Cagado Podcast. And then you'll see a subcategory for The Shit, which is the English version of the podcast. With that being said, that wraps us up for this episode. Thank you guys, and we'll catch you guys again next week.